Michelle Alexander.
I also wanted to mention that during the presentation, I wandered around over there, and when Laura said it was a silent auction, she didn't mean it had to be so silent that we couldn't hear the sound of pens writing bids on the paper. So we need you to get active and participate. Take a look at the artwork and please bid, all in the fun of supporting AFSC. I didn't mention Michelle's biography. I got a little carried away. So I wanted to give you that background. She graduated from Stanford Law School and Vanderbilt University, was the director of the Racial Justice Program of the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California. There she showed early promise as an educator because she gave Governor Davis an F for vetoing the racial profiling bill and the educational disparities bill. So we knew she was bound for the academy at that time. After that, she got to Stanford Law School, where she was the director of the Civil Rights Project there, and is now at Moritz College of Law at Ohio State Law School. So that's the bio. Now, I'm just going to add a couple of questions, but this is to give you all time to think, because, see, we fed you, we wined you, and dined you, but we didn't tell you that we were putting you to work. That was kind of a bribe. We are looking for all of you to help us put our heads together and solve the solution of building the movement that Michelle was talking about. So we're not asking for general questions. We'd like you to ask questions about how to build this movement that's been called for. Who remembers Stokely Carmichael? Oh, I like this group. I've never seen that many hands. Somebody, who was Stokely Carmichael? Someone. Somebody close to it. Here. Who was Stokely Carmichael?
Snick.
Snick.
Snick, that was a good one. Snick, and he said something 40 years ago that is just as true today. He said, we are past the time for description. The time is now for prescription. So we're not going to describe the problem. Michelle did that. We're going to talk about the prescription. So, my first question. And you all have to get the book if you haven't read it to follow along with this. In the last chapter, in your next steps question, you really call out some folks, not by name, but by category. You say the Gina 6 campaign was not the way to move forward because it was focused on images of past segregation. You said that the civil rights movement has been relatively quiet around the issue of mass incarceration, professionalized, preoccupied with litigation. You say that there's been an over-focus on higher class affirmative action. And you also say that too much trust has been placed in the Obama administration to get us out of this mess. So, are you being too hard? Is this tough love that you're giving to these folks? And so the question is, would synchronicity of these efforts, or coordination of these efforts, solve this problem? And if so, who would do it?
Well, to be clear, I wasn't opposed to the Gina 6 mobilization. What I argued there was that there would never have been the kind of media coverage of that demonstration and of those trials, but for the nooses that were hung from a tree, that it was the symbols of old Jim Crow racism that made it possible for a mainstream audience to understand that what had happened there was in fact racist. And the challenge, I believe, is not to persuade mainstream voters today that when nooses are hung, that's a bad thing. There's already a public consensus that those forms of racism and displays of racial bias ought to be rejected and condemned. The challenge for our time is to help the mainstream come to understand that what may not be obviously visible as biased operates in fact in a way that is highly discriminatory and even devastating to poor communities of color. And so part of the challenge in building this movement is to help to make visible what has laid invisible under this veneer of color blindness that exists today. So merely picking those cases for litigation or advocacy in which the N-word was used or a noose can be found doesn't advance the ball that much. Because a public consensus already exists that those forms of racial bias are wrong and ought to be condemned. The challenge for us is to take the routine forms of discrimination that occur in communities of color, the stop and frisk operations, the gang injunctions, all those forms of discrimination that are so easily rationalized in colorblind terms, and help people to see the racial character of those tactics and those forms of discrimination today. Now, as for kind of the tactics of advocacy, I believe that litigation has a role to play. What I've argued is that for too long, for the past few decades, far too much trust and faith has been placed in litigation and in our court system to deliver kind of justice for all, for the masses. And I think what we can see over the past 30 years is that we cannot look to the U.S. Supreme Court to protect people from racial bias. The U.S. Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias in the criminal justice system. You know, from every stage, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing, it's virtually impossible today to state a claim of racial bias in the criminal justice system in the absence of evidence of old Jim Crow racism. Some kind of admission or a racial slur. You can't even get in the courthouse doors without that kind of evidence today. So hoping that litigation strategies are going to save us from the severe racial bias that affects the system, I think is misguided. And I also believe that civil rights organizations have become too disconnected from the communities they claim to represent. And that if we are going to be successful in galvanizing a movement, it will not be a top-down movement, but one that meaningfully engages the people who have been most impacted by the system.